Previously, you've seen my film where I unboxed this Outbacker stove. And as I said in that film, the intention was when I got this that we were always going to fit it into our garden room. And that's what I'm going to do today. So let's have a look at where we're going to put it in the garden room. This is our small 10 by 12 garden room, and it's at the top of our wildflower meadow. And this is the location that I'm going to put the stove, on this platform here, which you can see in front of me. I've already done this preparatory work. Originally, what I've done is I've brought the stove in, set it on the floor. I thought that was too low, and it needs a hearth anyway to stop it scorching the floor. And so what I've done is I've built a box, a platform box made of MDF on which the stove will sit. That box and the back, the board, I have lined with a fireboard, which is a fireproof board, like a plasterboard, but it's fireproof. And then on top of that, you'll see that I have put ceramic tiles on. These are porcelain tiles, which are also heat proof. And using fireproof cement, I have attached those to the fireboard. So it gives this platform on which we can put the stove. And you'll see here at the bottom of the box, I've made a drawer, and that's a storage area that we're going to use when we have the stove in place. And that's the platform on which we're going to set the stove. So I'll bring the stove in, set it on the platform, and then take some measurements. That's roughly where the stove is going to be. There's room, plenty of room here on the hearth, so that any embers that fall out of the firebox aren't going to land on the floor. And then it's got the fireproofing behind it. Now for the exact placement, do you remember I had a rack, this rack that came with the stove? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fit that on the back. And so that's in place, and I'm going to move the stove just slightly back a bit so that I can still use this rack. I think that would be good for warming plates and putting pans. And then this is the flue, which is obviously going to go up through the ceiling. If you look at regulations about where to place a wood burning stove, obviously you shouldn't put it near combustible materials. That's why we've got this protection at the back here. And the minimum distance is something like 3 times the width of the flue from a combustible material, or 1.5 times the diameter of the flue from something like this. But we've got plenty of room here, and that's the position that we're going to put the stove on the hearth. The next job I need to do is actually cut the hole in the ceiling. And this is a double thickness ceiling, so I've got a inner skin, insulation, and then the actual roof of the shed itself. It's a job that you've got to make sure you measure correctly, because once you've cut the hole in the roof, there's no going back. So let's do the measuring. Now the measurements that I'm taking for the distance from the non-combustible board and the flue is correct at the time that I'm doing this for UK. Obviously where you live it may be totally different, but it's worth checking the regulations as to where you should put a stove. So to the middle of the stove from the back of the board, I've got a distance of 22 centimeters, and that allows for the distance I've got here on the depth of the tiles on the backing board. So 22 centimeters. When I cut the hole and go out through the ceiling, I'm using this fireproof flange, which is the fitting that will go on the actual roof of the shed, and the flue, this is silicone, this is a flue pipe, and that will go up through and out to take out the smoke from the top of the stove. What I've done is I've made a template for this steel ring that you can see here, and I've made that in cardboard to match not only the width of the ring but also the placement of where the bolts will be to secure it to the roof. And this is the template which I'm going to use, and you can see that there's the outer ring and then the center section. So I'm going to mark the center of this template. And now I'm going to mark on the ceiling where I'm going to cut the hole. I don't need the stove in place, so I'll move that back outside. So up on the ceiling here, I'm going to mark the 22 centimeters from the wall. And then I'll get the template, and I know that to the center is 12 centimeters of the template, because the template is going to go up there, and this is a main beam for the roof, so I don't want to be cutting that, I just want to be cutting the ceiling. So I'm going to put that right to the edge there, and that's 12 centimeters out, so I have to make sure that this 22 mark out is 12 centimeters in as well. So importantly, I'm just going to check that. That's 22 and 12. And that's right, so that's where the hole is going to be cut in the ceiling, which I'm going to do next. So I'm going to drill through the ceiling here, which is only thin ply, through the insulation, and then put a small pilot hole up through the roof of the shed itself. So having made the marker hole, what I do now is I've drilled another hole through the template, and I'm going to line that up to there, and then draw around the template. Next, I'm going to cut out this circle of the ceiling. This time, I just want to make sure I pierce the ply of the ceiling. I don't want to go through to the outside roof here. And now, very carefully, cut round the line with a saw. That's the insulation. So that's the hole in the ceiling cut out. Didn't go quite according to plan, forgot that button, but we come across these little things we have to overcome. I can neaten this hole up at the end. So now what we've got to do is go up onto the roof and cut the hole. Now I'll just pick up the flange. You can imagine that this is the heat shield that's going to go onto the ceiling, and it's designed so that it clamps onto something like a bell tent canvas, so it's got very small nuts, and that's big enough to clamp onto the ply and the roofing felt of the ceiling. But what you can see is we have a gap here of about, oh, I don't know, 2 inches or so, inch and a half, and instead of leaving that exposed, what I've got to make is a collar, an aluminium collar that hides this and disguises this. So So when you look at this flange, when I make this aluminium collar, I've got to attach it using these nuts. So it's got to come down the outside edge of the flange, and then there'll be a lip here on this ceiling, so this will be all neat and aluminium. But when I go up onto the roof and cut the hole, it sounds obvious, but don't forget, I'm not cutting a hole to this outside edge, I'm cutting it to this inner edge of this clamping ring. If you cut to that side, obviously this is just going to fall through. It sounds obvious, but these are little mistakes that can happen if you don't think the whole process through. So when I go up onto the roof, I'm going to mark to the inner of this ring, and that's the size of the hole that I'm going to be cutting. I'll do that now. So just there is the hole that I've made when I put the template in place from underneath. So I now take this template and put it directly over that hole. And then using a marker pen, I'll mark round where I've got to cut out. Next I'll drill a pilot hole, and then I can saw around the hole. Because of that piece of wood that comes along here that we saw from the underside, I'm going to cut straight across here and adapt the way I fix the flange to the top of this roof. One hole in the roof. The next job to do is drill out the holes on the flange, and I'm going to use the ring off the flange itself as a template and drill the holes through. I brought a bolt up with me, that'll keep it in place there. We know we're in the right place then. That secures it at that side, and then I just have to go around and cut the others. and that's how it's going to sit. Let's go back inside. So here on the inside, you can see what I've just done is removed the foil from the underside of the ceiling, of the roof, should I say, and there you can see the bolt holes which I've drilled from above. The next job I want to do is to make an aluminium collar that fits round here. Firstly, it will neaten it up, but also it will reflect any heat that's coming from the flue here. It will reduce the heat onto the edge of the ceiling. Now, because of this little beam here, I'm going to have to make a little adjustment I hadn't planned on. And this is the underside fixing ring for the flange, and of course it doesn't fit here. So what I'm going to have to do, I'll just get my pen. When I go up to the workshop, I'm going to have to just cut this bit of metal off here, there, and there. And instead of using a nut and bolt to fix this hole, what I'm going to use is a small coach screw to fix into this beam. What I've got to do next is measure the distance here, which is, by the time you put the flange on it, it's going to be 50 mil. So I'm going to make a metal collar of 50 mil that fits round here and makes this a neat and sort of fireproof aperture. I'll go and do that up at the workshop. I'm now on to making the aluminium collar for the aperture in the ceiling. So I've got some thin aluminium sheeting here, and what I need to do is, if you can imagine that we're looking at the underside of the aperture there, that's the ceiling, and then smoke goes out that way. The inner flange is obviously smaller, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a collar that has a lip at the top, then it drops down the depth of the ceiling, and then it will come round to form a neat collar there. Now, I know that once I cut this, the section that I need off the underside flange, that the length of aluminium that I need is actually 58 centimeters. The sheet that I've got is only 50 long, so I'm going to make it, so I'm going to rivet it and make it into a longer strip with a rivet in the middle. It won't look too bad because you'll hardly see it, and then join them both together. So what I need is a long strip of aluminium, and because of the depth of the ceiling, the insulation area, that needs to be 5 centimeters. Then I want some tabs to come over and bolt onto this flange, and this is 2 centimeters, so I need to put a lip on the top there of 2 centimeters, and then on the underside of the ceiling, to make it neat, I'm just going to put a bit of a lip on the underside. It will form like a ring on the underside of the ceiling itself, and that can be quite small because this is easily flexible, so that can just be like a 5 mil or 0.5 of a centimeter. So in total I want 7.5 centimeter strip, 58 long. Now what I might do is I won't cut this, I might just make it a long strip and then take it down to the garden room and bend it round on the inside of the aperture and screw it to that batten that you saw me cutting earlier, and then screw it to that so it's nice and secure to the batten. But obviously this is something, as long as I get a 75 mil strip, as long as I can. So I'll get on and cut that. So that's the flange cut and the 2 strips of aluminium. Now I've just got to mark 2 centimeters on both of those to form the tabs at the top, and then 0.5 centimeter on the bottom to form that nice finish on the ceiling. Well, after a bit of fabrication, I'll show you what I've got. That's the flange, and then from those 2 strips of tin, what I've done is I've taken those 2 strips, and you can see there that I've riveted them together on that side, and then I have bent over inwards. I've bent over the top 2 centimetre flap or tabs, and then I've bent down. But in the meantime, I used tin snips to cut these V grooves in. That will allow me to bend the collar into its shape around the aperture in the ceiling of the shed. And then what I have to do now is go down to the shed and fit this into the roof and attach it to the flange. Earlier on, when I cut the hole out, this piece of wood from the ceiling came out. I'm going to reattach that now because it'll look better, and it'll also help with attaching the flange or the collar. Now I need to do a dry run of fixing this, just see if it fits, and get ready to attach it. So it'll go in here. I've got the holes already drilled where the nuts are going to go, and I can see where I pre-drilled them earlier. If I try to match them up, into that, that's looking really good. There's an overlap of the collar here, so I'm just going to get a pencil. In fact, that sits on its own. Let me just get a pencil. I'm going to mark that there and there, and then I'll cut those 2 ends off, and then that will be screwed to this bit of wood, and then the nuts will hold the rest of it in place. Tin snips will give a nice clean cut. Fit. Really pleased with that. And then what I'm going to do is just put an edge on there, and then these 2 ends will be held in place by countersunk screws, and then the nuts on the flange will hold everything else in place. Moving on to the next job, which is fitting the flange for the flue onto the roof and then putting all this bit together. Now, our standard bits of flue pipe are these. They're 60 mil, and let me just put that down. That would fit okay through there. It's a little bit loose, but I went and bought an extra bit of flue pipe, which I'll just get out of the box now. And it's one of these. Now this is a twin wall flue pipe. You can see down it there. It is the standard size 60 mil flue pipe there, but it's got a twin wall on it. and that extends it up to 90mm across. And the idea of this is that you would put it and it would stay fairly cool. You're not actually going to get the highest heat from that pipe, because this will cool some of it down. And my intention is to fit this at the section where it goes through the ceiling and through the roof. And so it needs to fit in through there. Now that's the 60mm bit. This is going to be 90mm, so I need to trim off this section of the silicone so that this fits nice and snugly on there, because obviously you don't want rain coming down through the gap between here and here. So I'm going to cut that now, and that should fit nice and snug, and that will fit through the section of the roof. Okay, I've taken a little edge off that. On the side of the flange, on this one here anyway, you can see it's got the pipe diameter. The markings are set on it here, and so you use that as a guide for when you're taking sections off that. Taking off too much, you've wasted the whole thing. So I've taken it up to 90mm, and we give that a go now, just to give it a test, and hopefully it's going to be right, because obviously it's got to fit so snugly that you don't get water coming in. And that's brilliant. That's going to be pushed up through the ceiling, through this rubber section, and then add this nice tight connection to it so the rain doesn't get in. Let's move on to actually fitting this now. I'm going to start at the inside. I'm going to put the metal flange first, the cut one, and then put the collar on, and then for each of the holes I'm going to put a bolt with a washer on it up through. And because of the way that the holes have been cut, hopefully the friction should hold everything in place until I get up onto the roof and be able to do all the knots up. So let's try that first. It's probably going to take a little bit of manoeuvring to get it right, but hopefully if everything lines up, it'll be just fine. Just hold that in place for a minute. Right, that's all the bolts put in from the underside. They're being held in purely by friction now. I'm going to go onto the roof and attach the flange and get that all tightened up and sealed up. I can see the bolts have come through, and just before I put everything together, that's the top ring. I'm just going to have a practice. You'll see that this flange has got a bit of a thin metal strip on here, so it gives it some flexibility. So that would be very useful if you had a bit of a corrugated roof or something like that. But ours is fairly flat, but it has got the roofing felt on it. So I'll talk about that in a minute. I'm just put them over the bolts first, just to make sure everything fits. They seem to be pretty good. And then what I'm going to do, before I put the this one just dropped out. Before I put this flange on, because of the roofing felt, there's bound to be some water that can leach into there. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a good seal of silicone round here, and then when I clamp everything down, that silicone should form a waterproof seal around the edge of the flange. And I'll be generous with it because I'd rather put a bit of extra silicone on than have to come up and reseal it at a later date. And the idea is to make sure you get every element of that, even around the bolts, I suppose. Anywhere that water's got a chance of getting in, you want to seal it up. And of course, once I clamp it all down, it'll all squish down. So let's put the top on there. Before we put the stove in place, there's one last job which I forgot to include in fitting this cowling on the roof, and that's up here. You can see between the collar I've made there and then the silicone flange, there's a space, and that's the space, the thickness of the wood of the roof itself, and that wood is still exposed. So I've a couple of strips of this same aluminium, and I've cut them to the width of that wood. And the next job I'm going to do, a bit fiddly, but I'm going to put that strip, I've got a couple of these, and I'm going to put those in there and tack them in so that they form that sort of heat reflector between the wood and the flue. And that's my next job. I'm going to get on and do that now. And that's the little strip collar fitted in. I'll show you what it's like. It's keeping the wood protected from the heat of the flue, even though there shouldn't be too much with that twin wall pipe on it. But that's what we've got there, and you can see it's in there. Now, this isn't as neat a finish as I'd like. I'm fairly particular in the finish, so I am at some stage, not today, I'm going to tidy all this up and perhaps paint this so that I'm more of a tidy finish. But it's just starting to rain, so what we're going to do is we're going to go outside, and I'll get the stove in, and we'll bring the stove in, fit the flue, and maybe get it going. It's just starting to spit with rain, so I'll put the stove in place and just give it a little bit of wipes. Had a bit of rain on it. And we'll put it in place. Now you can see that the stove is rocking slightly, and my platform is completely level and flat, but it rocks, and you can see that the legs are extended, and that means that you wouldn't notice it on soft ground, but on a hard surface like this, that rocking not only would annoy me, but it shows that it's probably not level. And I've got a spirit level here. This problem basically stems from that the legs are obviously all made equal, but the way they're fitted probably means that they're not perfectly level when you put them on the ground. But it's important to get it right here. So I've got a spirit level, and it's not too bad left to right, but back to front it's much higher. Now I knew this because I had a trial run of it earlier, and what I've done, I've got a couple of pads which I've made here. These are quite solid rubber. I'll show you those. They're quite little solid rubber pads, and we've made these so that they will level this stove up. Leveling the stove is something because when you're cooking, you want the pans to be nice and level so that any fluids are going to be not spilling all over the place, and also nice and solid. But also, when you fit the flue, that you've got to have it vertical, and this will cure the problem. So I've just got a couple of these pads to fit in. Just put them underneath the feet. As I say, we've done this, and if you've got this problem as well, little rubber pads would be fine. They're not going to get hot because the legs are cool. But now that I've done it, that's it, perfectly level and stable. That's not going anywhere. Next task is to fit the flue and connect it to the cowling at the top. As I showed you before, this is the twin wall section that we've got, that we're going to put up through the ceiling area of the shed. Sorry, garden room I should call it. I shouldn't call it a shed. Get told off for that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to push this up through the silicone hood so that the silicone comes just to that rim. Something I've noticed that when I've been putting this together, if you're going to be working on this type of a flue from Outbacker stoves, and you get this, these edges here are particularly sharp. I've cut myself a couple of times just there, so be really careful when you're pushing it up, because that's where you're going to maybe cut yourself. So I'll push that up. And fit that so it's just exposed on the top of the hood. I'll go up the ladder and show you. Seems we've come out there. You can see that's pretty good. I'm just going to move it down slightly. It's a very tight fit, but just gently working the rubber or the silicone, whatever it is, right up to the edge of the thickest part, or the twin wall of this flue section. And as I showed in the unboxing, the wider end of each section of flue goes uppermost. So that's that. We'll go back in and fit the flue on the stove. I've got the sections of the flue here. These sections are the ones which I know will fit between here and the bottom of the twin wall section. As I showed in the unboxing, the section of flue with the wide flanges at both ends goes on first. And then here we've got 6 other sections, 3 small, 3 large, because that combination is just the right length for between here and that upper section. and then this bit will fit in there. Obviously, you've got to be able to maneuver this so that you can get the flue together with that being in already and the stove in place. So what I've done, a trial, and this is how I've worked it, is I put the lengths of flue together. Put it on there, move it right up to there, and you can just see it's exactly the right length, but of course you've got to get into there, and that's where the flexibility of the cowling comes in. So by pushing it up hard, it slots in, and that is just absolutely right. So that's all connected together. Now I'm thinking from back here, let's have a look. I'm thinking that looks pretty good. If anything, the stove is slightly too far to the right, and this is the thing, because I've not fixed the stove in place and it's not that heavy, I can move it so that it's exactly so that the flue is level. Let me get the spirit level on that. I know it's picky, but it's just the way I am. If I'm sitting on an evening watching the stove and this isn't quite right, it's going to bug me. So it just needs to go a couple of inches to the left. Move the pads. And that's it. Perfect. And I know it'll be right this way, because when I took the measurement from there and measured the hole, that was going to be right. So there's the bottom section of the flue on. Looks pretty smart. Now I've got that in place, obviously we have to do the top sections of flue, and I've got those outside just here. These are the remainder of the sections of flue that come with the stove, and this is the piece which will go on the very top. Because it's starting to rain, I'm just going to do the next bit inside. As you can see, this will be the top section of flue, and we're going to keep the stove in place for all sorts of weathers. But I had the concern that, I just hold it this way so you can see it better. I had a concern that on a day when it's raining outside and driving rain, that rain's going to get into some of these holes, go down the inside of the flue, and then go down and land and sit in the stove. So you'll get rain sitting in there, and that's a potential for getting rust on the stove, and I certainly don't want that. And I had an idea, and hopefully this is going to work. I had an idea about how to solve that problem, and I looked online, and from good old eBay I've bought this. This is called a Chinaman's hat because it's shaped like a Chinaman's hat, and it's meant as a flue top, a cowling for the top of a flue. You get them for wood burning stoves, you get them for normal chimneys. They're easily to find online, but I've bought this one because it's the smallest size that they do. The diameter of the Outbacker stove chimney is 60mm, and what I want to do is fit the Chinaman's hat on top of my very utmost section of flue pipe. But I want an air gap so the air can still be drawn up round, and obviously smoke can come out at the top. But what it'll do, if I fit it in like that, it'll prevent rain from being driven in to this section and down. If it drives against here, it's just going to run and drip off the outside of the Chinaman's hat section. What I've got to do next is, using 3 bolts and nuts, I'm going to drill a hole round here, or 3 holes should I say, equally distant around the outside of this collar, and then I'm going to put bolts from, difficult to do, but I'm going to put bolts out of here so that they fit in and secure the Chinaman's hat to the top of the flue. That's my next job. So to fit the Chinaman's hat to the top section of the flue, the spark arrestor, I'll I'll do it here because it's raining a bit at the minute and it's a good floor. I'll clear this out of the way so that you might be able to see it. How I'm going to do it is I'm going to fit some bolts, 3 bolts, out of these holes so they come out on 3 different sections of the flue. And then using nuts on those bolts, I'm going to drill 3 equivalent holes on this Chinaman's hat and then bring the bolts out here, put a nut on the outside, and that will secure it nice and tightly onto the top of the flue. The first thing to do is to get the 3 bolts. Now, because I know that's 60mm wide and that's 100, then there's a 20mm gap either side of this to fit into there. So what I've done is I've got some 25mm nuts, 25mm bolts, and I'm going to put a washer on each of those. This is going to be fiddly. I can tell it's going to be fiddly already, but I've got to put the bolt up inside that flue section, and how I'm going to do it is using a pair of long pliers. Bring them up to there, bring the bolt out with the washer on it, and then using the pliers to steady it. I shouldn't have let that go, but actually how I can do it is I have a bit of wood here, even better. Put that bit of wood inside to hold the bolt in place, and then put a washer, put a nut on it. Not going to do it up too tight at the minute, as long as it holds the bolt and the washer in place. Do that again. Put that out there. And then the last one will come out this hole. Now, this isn't something that I've actually seen on YouTube or anyone doing it. It has to be particular, I suppose, to this flue section, and if you're going to fit it in fairly permanently into a garden room location like we've done. This isn't going to be quite even because there's not an even number of, so there's 10 holes around this spark arrestor section. I just have to get that one in. For some reason that's gone here. But as I say, this isn't something that I've seen done on YouTube because it's very particular to this stove and the way I'm doing it. But it might be useful to someone who's got a similar idea or has got problems with rain coming down the top section of flue. So hopefully someone will find it helpful. And just hold that in place. You missed it. That's it. So that's the bolts on the top section of flue. Now, they do look pretty good as evenly spaced, and of course they're going to go on there and just out there. So what I have to do now is drill the 3 holes in the collar of the Chinaman's hat to match up with those, and then I'll put the nuts on to hold those in place. So I've drilled the 3 holes on the Chinaman's hat section, and the bolts will fit in there. Now, because I've left the bolts fairly loose, they're not tight, and so there's room for a bit of play just to check that these will go in, and they just fit. In fact, the galvanized section of the Chinaman's hat means that you can maneuver them in and out, and then I'll be able to tighten the nuts up. So this first nut that I've put on will hold the bolt and grip it and tighten up against this section of flue. So what I have to do next is put one more nut on the thread of each bolt. As you can see, they're all still loose. Next thing I'm going to do is put the bolts through the outer edge of the Chinaman's hat. So just feed one in like that. And then I've got these locking nuts, and I'm just going to put them just onto the end of each thread, just to hold it in place. Use the kit that you've got. Last one. Now you can see inside how I've done it. It looks fairly even there, and there are two nuts on the threads inside. One needs to be tightened up towards the flue, and the other needs to be tightened up on the inside of the Chinaman's hat. When I've done all those, tightened all the nuts up, it should be straightforward and go and setting it on there. I'm pleased with that effect, and I think that's going to be making the top of the flue really weatherproof. And that's the Chinaman's hat fitted to the flue. All I have to do now is go up onto the roof and put the top section of the flue in place. Now, these are the sections that I've got left that came with the stove. And what I am going to use is use all elements of the flue to give this the maximum height. I think that improves draw on the stove and also keeps the smoke well away from the area that we might be sitting out, or with the doors open or something like that. But I've seen people, you could just probably put this on top, but it's too close to the roof for me. I'm going to use all sections, so I'll go and do that now. To make it easier to carry up the ladder, I put one section on the spark arrestor end and the Chinese hat first, and then put the other three sections together. Obviously this is going to be quite height, and the simplest way to do it is to make it all in one piece here, like that, and then slot it into there. Now there's a bit of movement here, and I'm not going to do it today, but what I may do is fit the ring that came with the... In fact, I'll go and get it. There you are. If you saw me doing the unboxing, you'll remember this Jubilee clip with the two wire rings on it. And what that's for, as I explained in the unboxing, is to act really as stabilizers for the top section of flue. Now, obviously this is being supported here, but as you can see, there's a bit of movement of the flue just there. So I brought a little knife up with me, and I'm not going to do it today because it's raining and it's not windy, as you can see, but I'm going to put this in place quite high up here. I'll tighten it up, And at some point in the future, I'll put a couple of wires affixed to the roof of the garden room, and especially as we're coming up to winter now, and we do live in a very, let's say, weather-prone area, I'll just secure it using this fitting. That should do it for now, and then I'll just get a couple of wires at a later stage. And that's the flue section on. Really, that's the stove now in place. I'll have a bit of a tidy up, and we'll give a stove a little bit of a burn to see how effective it is inside the garden room. Well, with the stove in place and the flues all together, everything's ready to give it a trial run inside the garden room. Like we did before, we're going to just use the small fire lighting blocks to get it going. Put 3 of those in, and then we're going to use just heat logs for this and not normal dried timber, because we find these burn really well. So I'll just put a couple of these going, make sure everything's in place in order. Just put a couple of those in. And then a couple of these little sections of heat logs, just putting the small ones in first. I'm only going to have a bit of a gentle fire this afternoon to get it going, just to make sure that everything is working and we're not going to have a accident. There we are, you can just about see it go in there. So we'll give it a few minutes and let that take. Everything looks fine. What I'll do this afternoon, I'll just let it go, get the temperature up a bit. I'll test the heat around the opening in the ceiling, and then just check outside. We'll be able to see the smoke, hopefully gently coming away from the chimney. Yeah, it's hard to see it. I've contrasted it against that tree, but you can see that the Chinaman's hat and the flue seems to be working okay. That's going really nicely. In fact, it's up to about 180 degrees C now, and it's really cozy. We've got the door open just to see how it goes on the first afternoon. But while I'm sitting here, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to get this set up, and that's our carbon monoxide alarm. And it's very important to have one of these. Carbon monoxide is a killer, and unlike smoke, you can't smell it, you can't see it. And so we'll set up one of these, and it will give a warning of any high values of carbon monoxide. We don't intend leaving this stove unattended at any time. It's just too risky in a wooden garden shed in a garden room, even though I've put all the precautions in place. But the carbon monoxide, we could be sitting here on an evening having a good time, and we'd never know that the carbon monoxide is about unless we have one of these. So I'm going to set this up, and we'll have it here in place as our warning in case of any carbon monoxide. Of course, as well as the carbon monoxide alarm, we do have a fire blanket and a fire extinguisher to hand as well in the garden room. Now that the stove's in, we've had a bit of a tidy up, and we may as well test it. So the kettle's on for a cup of tea. Well, that seems to be a rather successful installation of the stove in the garden room. Just burns away nicely, good for putting the kettle on and making a cup of tea. In the future, we'll be doing some cooking on the right hand side in the oven or on the hot plate. And I might film some of those just out of interest to show how this stove works in this sort of environment. I hope you've enjoyed the film. If you have, don't forget, just click the like button, and even better, subscribe to my channel, because I'll be putting some more films on in the near future, both about the stove and back to doing some refurbishment on my camper van, the MV200. But while I enjoy the cup of tea, thanks for watching.